Hey everyone, welcome back to the Conversations with Adrian podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark Gober. Mark, I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Adrian.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Man, you are an interesting guy. I have been listening to, we're just talking off air, I've been listening to a bunch of podcasts with you. I have to admit, I haven't bought any of your books, but they're on my list. I've got a pile 15 deep on the side of my bedside drawers that I need to get through. But I really am intrigued by the way that you think and what you write. You've been smashing out books left, right, and center for the last couple of years, it seems. So anyway, there's a lot to talk about, and I just find it really fascinating. But before we get into everything, maybe you can catch me up on, I guess, the trajectory of where you were to where you are now. You seem like there was a shift at some point in your life that made you think differently about the world. Can you sort of like maybe segue into that before we get started?
Yeah, that shift started for me in 2016, which has propelled me on this journey to start writing and speaking about these sorts of topics. And prior to that, I had a totally mainstream background. I went to Princeton University for undergrad. I was a competitive tennis player growing up. I was one of the captains of the tennis team at Princeton. Then I worked in investment banking in New York during the financial crisis, 2008 to 2010. And then I worked first in Boston, but then most of my time was in Silicon Valley at another company where I was advising companies on their innovations, intellectual property, patented technologies. So that was my world. And while I was working in Silicon Valley, I felt at the time like my life hit a wall in many ways, like personally, professionally, and metaphysically. I just thought life was random and meaningless. And I thought that's what science was teaching us increasingly. And that
Mm,
beliefs like religion or spirituality, those were superstitions that science had transcended. I was very much in that place. And the older I got, the more I thought that was true. But then in 2016, I was already in a place where, like I said, my life, I felt like I was on this treadmill, not really sure where I was going. And I started listening to podcasts that year. They were becoming more prevalent.
mhm,
And started off listening to Tim Ferriss because a friend of mine sent an interview with Mark Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist. And then Tim Ferriss was talking about all sorts of alternative health ideas. Then I started listening to alternative health podcasts, came across one called Extreme Health Radio, and was listening to a bunch of those shows. And they had a woman on who was a psychic and talked about using her psychic abilities to advise clients. Her name's Laura Powers. And at the end of that interview, Laura said that she has her own podcast called Healing Powers. And then I listened to that podcast, and there were lots of other people talking the way she was talking, like things that sounded crazy to me. The idea of life after death, stuff like people had direct experiences of this stuff. And there was a little bit of science. And I remember thinking, I just couldn't believe that there were so many people who seemed to be independent, meaning they didn't know each other. They had very different backgrounds, and they were describing this view of reality that was foreign to me. So then I started to read books and scientific papers and saw there was all this evidence that I never knew existed. And it came from Princeton University. I didn't even know they had a lab there run by the former dean of engineering, which studied psychic phenomena. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I'm now on the board of, has been studying these phenomena for decades. The University of Virginia has a division of perceptual studies that's been studying this sort of thing. The US government has declassified documents that talk about psychic spying, for example, among many other things. So I
mm.
saw all the stuff that was just mind blowing to me, and I got hooked on it. All of a sudden, I just wanted to understand, well, if even 1% of this stuff is true, then I have to rethink what a human being is basically, or whether life has meaning. Maybe there's much more than I thought. And all I wanted to do basically when I wasn't in the office was learn about this stuff. So in 2017, about a year into researching just for fun, I decided to summarize my findings into a book, which is called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And it was published in 2018. Then in 2019, I produced Where is My Mind podcast with Blue Duck Media, which goes through very
Great
similar
podcast.
stuff. Thank you.
I've sent
Um,
that to so many people. That is fucking brilliant. I loved it. Yeah.
Well, we can thank Matt Ford, my producer, because he was the one who said to me, Mark, we need to make this into an interactive podcast with where it's really well produced, music in the background. We're going to
Mm.
take clips from the people you interview, because if we just do long form, you're not going to have the same impact. So he really wanted to make it mainstream, and I listened to him. But it was a very involved project to script it and to do all the
Yeah.
production. But I'm glad we did, and that includes dozens of interviews with Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, Brian Josephson, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, Eben Alexander, a former Harvard neurosurgeon. So some very credible people on
I've
the
interviewed
podcast.
Eben.
Okay, great. Yeah, he's a fascinating guy. He's done great work. And so that brought me to the end of 2019. I was a partner at my firm in Silicon Valley. The first book in the podcast series were out. I didn't have plans of doing any more. I really didn't know where I was going to take this stuff. And the initial work was just on like basically the science of consciousness and the philosophical implications and this notion of something that's transcending the body. And I was feeling like my job was just not resonating in the same way that it used to, and yet I was being pulled by my curiosity elsewhere. So at the end of 2019, I decided to tell my business partners I was going to leave the firm, and then worked part-time for the first few months of 2020. Of course, not knowing COVID was going to happen, at least not
Mm.
consciously. So I ended up in this very strange position, because I was phasing out of my job, and I wrote my second book during that period, An End to Upside Down Living, which is basically thinking about how to orient one's life with this new view of consciousness, the new view of reality, and spiritual awakenings generally. But then I was in lockdowns. I'd left my job, and I started to explore what was going on in the world and all the apparent corruption and the censorship and what was actually going on with COVID. And that led me to start looking at politics, and the which I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Liberty. And then I was very curious about the forces that might be influencing politics and our power
Mm.
structures and just society in general. And that's my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, which is about non-human intelligence. And then I wrote a book called An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is on the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and where they're trying to steer society and how that fits into everything else I had been studying. And
Wow.
most recently wrote An End to Upside Down Medicine, which is on basically a challenge to allopathic medicine. We can get into that if you want, but it looks at germ
Yeah.
theory versus terrain theory, a lot of the things that are hot right now.
Yeah,
And
for
so
sure.
I've been in this period for the last few years of just continuing to say, I'm not really sure what's next. And then I get wind of a new paradigm shift that rocks my world. And then I decide to share it in a book. So that's where
Mm.
we are now. 6 books have been published, and I am just increasingly curious about all this stuff because I feel like the more I learn, the more I actually don't really know.
Yeah. Man, it's so impressive. How do you write so quick? How do you produce so much information like so quickly?
In hindsight, I was trained to do this.
Really?
So I think with my tennis background, I developed a lot of discipline. I was always disciplined academically. At Princeton, there was a requirement for almost every department that undergrads had to write a thesis in order to graduate. And that's not common for undergrad. Usually you hear that in like for a dissertation or something for a PhD. So I had to write a thesis. So I had this mindset of like learning how to write, but I never really liked writing. And I think um, my professional background, 10 years working in strategy consulting in Boston and Silicon Valley, I
Mm.
was accustomed to having to take large amounts of information and learn about very technical topics because these were patented technologies in basically every domain you could imagine. Because patents apply to not just the tech world, it's every industry has technology effectively that they're using. So I always had to learn about, well, what's this technology? How does it apply to the company's business? And then collate this information to present it to boards of directors and senior management teams. So I had to learn a lot, make sure I got nothing wrong, and then be able to present it in a concise manner to people. So I was basically applying all these things I was doing all the time. And these were fire drills. So it was like, we got to get this to the client tomorrow. So I would be staying up very late, very often,
Yeah.
where I had these tight time frames. So I just
Crank it
applied
out.
that to researching these other topics that I'm even more passionate about.
Wow. That's awesome. It's I don't know if this resonates with you or whether it's a correct I don't know, like analogy, but you sound like if Bon Jovi come out with a hit in rock and then he sort of decided to come out with another hit in reggae. Do you know what I mean? And then did country music and then did opera. Like it's almost like you took a skill but then turned it into like just many different genres. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's different applications of a similar process
Yeah.
to try to examine a current paradigm and then look for the anomalies or where there is something that's illogical within it and then show, wow, there's all this evidence that contradicts the paradigm we're taught. There's a new paradigm. And by the way, when you look at all these things together that sound like they're disparate, like political and economic theory and
Mm.
consciousness science and non-human intelligence and allopathic medicine, actually they all fit together into trying to understand what this place is that we're in, what a human being is, and where society's headed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you look at, particularly from my perspective, when you look at, say, the political side of things, and you look at monetarily, like there's definitely a link in terms of how that sort of correlates together. The medicine side, I mean, that's an interesting thing, because it kind of does mend into this sort of totalitarian type of like you mentioned, the Great Reset and all that kind of stuff. So that sort of one world government, it kind of all ties into, particularly with COVID and the mandates and the vaccines and all that kind of stuff. That kind of ties together. How do you connect the dots between consciousness and like all those sorts of things?
Yeah, well, I would just want to double click on what you said about COVID because I totally agree.
Mm,
Klaus Schwab's book, which co-written by Thierry Malloret, it's called COVID-19: The Great Reset.
yeah.
So they were talking about the use of a medical emergency or an apparent medical emergency to reset society. They also talk a lot about climate, which has a similar theme, where the fear of human-caused climate change could be used for authoritarian means to control human behavior. Now, how consciousness fits into all this stuff is the way I look at consciousness now is that it's a fundamental aspect of reality, or the fundamental aspect of reality, of which everything that we call material emerges. So that metaphysical framework for the nature of reality will be important to every discipline. The Great Reset, medicine, politics, because we have to understand all of those things in the context of the reality that we're in. And often what we see, it's the same theme that in allopathic medicine, in the Great Reset, and so forth, they're often leaving out this metaphysics. There's a reductionistic perspective that's implicit. Often, sometimes it's explicit, but often implicit that, yeah, there's no afterlife, there's no soul. Everything that we talk about in the world can be reduced to physical matter, and that human consciousness is ultimately just physical matter in a human body that's interacting in a certain way. And because of a brain, consciousness just pops out. And when you get rid of the brain, that's the end of your sense of experiencing life. That's the current paradigm. It's known as scientific materialism or physicalism, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that paradigm is not correct, in which case the body is more like a vessel of consciousness, a receiver, transmitter, transducer, filtering mechanism, meaning that consciousness is something that is within us, that we are enacting consciousness through the body. We're a vehicle or a vessel rather than the producer of consciousness. And that means we are inherently spiritual beings. That's the implication of what all that science points to. So if we're spiritual beings, then how do we structure society? Where should we change society in certain ways? Should it be in the direction of the Great Reset? How should we think about health and disease? How should we think about other spiritual beings that might exist that we don't always see with our eyes? They might be advanced, and maybe they've been interacting with human civilization for a long time. So these are the sorts of questions that they really all stem from the question of consciousness, because that is core to the nature of reality.
Mm. I think that what I like about what you're saying is it's almost like we've been led to believe that all of these things are compartmentalized, or they're separate from one another. But in actual fact, it's kind of like it's all interconnected. And I mean, there's something that's been touted in the last couple of years, particularly since COVID, is that it's a spiritual war, and it's a war in our consciousness, because things to do with our sovereignty have been slowly eroded and taken away, and so free thinking has been squashed. I mean, like to have an opinion that is not conducive to the current narrative, or whatever the WF is saying, or the whatever three-letter agency is saying, is we've been demonized for having a different view, whether that be political or religious or whatever it may be. So is that your take on it? Is that kind of what you're saying? The overarching theme is that there's almost like an attack on consciousness to subdued or reduce us to thinking that we don't have any control over our own free thinking or our own body, or to anything to do with healing, or there's much more to life than we've been led to believe. It's almost like it's been compartmentalized, so we don't know exactly what's going on, and it's so the pieces of the puzzle are so fragmented that we can't put it all together. Am I making sense?
Yeah, you're making sense. And I think that what you just described is the reason that I've written so many books, because if you look at traditional political theory, they're not talking about the science of consciousness with it. So I continue to see this gap in the literature, or even the Great Reset, the metaphysics and consciousness. People aren't talking about that aspect of it. So I'm taking the parts that are maybe more commonly talked about and then combining consciousness in all these cases, because I see that there's something really missing. Now, the other point of what you just said is basically the why. Why is it that everything is compartmentalized this way? Why are we taught disciplines in this manner? And initially, when I first started this in 2016, it seemed to me like there was just a lot of ego. So you'd have scientists and PhDs and professors who learned one way of thinking. And what I was describing, and I'm just synthesizing what other people have been studying. If this is true, then their PhDs and everything that they've been saying is either incomplete or wrong. So they would have an incentive to want to protect the current paradigm for the sake of their own ego. I think that's part of it, but now I'm much more in line with what you said, that there is a spiritual war, that there is an active desire to suppress the truth, likely from dark metaphysical forces, which I talk about a lot in and into Upside Down Contact, the dark and the light forces that we can't always see with our eyes, that seem to be impacting things on the planet and impacting human consciousness. So that raises a big question about what should we do about it. And everyone has I've heard so many different opinions on it, but I think learning the truth, uncovering the truth, and then living in accordance with it, and then sharing it, that's really central.
Yeah, for sure. I've got a bunch of questions that are coming up. I just don't know which one to pick first. I think so what I'm interpreting from everything that you're starting to unveil is it's almost like you could probably get all of your books and combine them into one big kind of like Bible in a sense, So it's probably the wrong word to use, but it's almost an evolution of pulling everything together to make people understand that there's all those pieces of the pie that need to come together.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know from your perspective, coming from this kind of sciencey, educated background, I guess more maybe detached from yourself because you had that kind of like, I don't know what's going on with who I am or what I'm doing and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of like the age-old question is like, why are we here? What's our purpose and meaning in life? Would you feel that, well, give me your perspective. Like, is what you're doing now, have you, through the discovery and the curiosity of wanting to know what's going on and uncovering the truth, have you now realized what purpose and meaning and passion and making a contribution or to living life, is that kind of something that's been evolving internally as like where Mark Gober fits in the world?
It's constantly evolving. I think it's a question that every person is asking ultimately, of what should I be doing given that I'm here? And in some ways it hasn't changed because I just am very interested in the nature of reality. I like learning things. And then when I get to a point where I feel like my thoughts are organized, for some reason, my instinct is I should write this down and cite all my sources in a book. That's just been my process so far.
Yeah.
But the areas that I've gone into, though, are not ones I would have predicted. For example, I was never interested in politics at all. And then I'm writing a book on political theory in conjunction with economic theory. Or I've always been interested in health to some degree, but not like questioning germ theory, or these are just things that were not on my radar. And that's part of it's unexpected. So I try to remain in a place of not knowing what's going to happen and being receptive with the intent of getting at the truth. And the key there is not holding on to any belief systems. And what I found to be really helpful is to always ask myself, how is it that I know this thing that I think I know, like really deeply? And then it turns into, well, someone's told me it was true. Well, how did they come to that conclusion? And then peeling back the onion with all of that it takes time and effort to do it, but it makes me less inclined to want to say that I know something for sure. And the more I've learned, the more I'm questioning everything that we talk about in society.
Mm. So, Mark, how do you do that? Like, how do you continue on through life with a particular goal or meaning or outcome that you want to achieve, but still maintain the perspective that I'm not married to any idea or belief system, and becoming almost like absolute in the way that you think? Like if someone was to come along and talk about germ theory versus terrain theory, or, you know, do viruses exist and all those sorts of things, yeah, how do you, knowing what you know and doing all the research that you have, how do you not say, uh, like with absolute confidence, that this is my position?
Hmm. Well, I don't have absolute confidence in any of the positions. The only thing I have confidence in is that right now at this moment, it feels like I'm having a conscious experience. And then everything from there is a form of an inference, even the past, which is a memory that occurs in the present moment that I'm experiencing. So the past is even inferential. So there's like levels of inference with regard to things like terrain theory or does consciousness come from the brain. I would say that if you ask me one or the other, Adrian, I would say it's this. I would pick this side because of X, Y, and Z, but I can't be certain. So, like with regard to viruses, the way that I phrase it is I don't think viruses, using the very specific definition that we have in the modern era of this intracellular parasite that gets inside of a host cell and replicates and causes disease in the host and then can be transmitted to another person to cause the same disease, that sort of a specific definition, that has not been established to exist using the scientific method, i.e., having an independent variable and proper controls.
Mm,
I think that's a conservative statement to make. Someone else might go farther and say there are no viruses. And if you ask me, like we could talk about whether and what the level of confidence is, but that's how I think about it. It's like a scale of confidence where it's never 100%, because I just don't think it ever can be, other than my knowledge of my own consciousness right now.
mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think you probably agree that the last couple of years in particular, because people have had to almost like choose a side, and
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to viruses, vaccines, you know, all these sorts of things, politics, you know, there's all this, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? And some people have got absolute conviction in their belief systems as to what they think is their version of the truth, but anything outside of that is not entertained. It's almost like if we're having this conversation and someone might be listening and thinking, I do believe viruses exist and vaccines are necessary. And so hearing what you say, they might totally discount everything about Mark Gober because that belief system doesn't align.
Mhm.
Or they might say, um, you know, there are evil forces at play, and everything's run by the black hats, and you know, there's a biblical prophecy that's been, you know, expressed, and this is the timeline that we're playing out. So the moment you start to think otherwise or say otherwise, they're like, well, I'm not listening to anything else. So people have I don't know, this sort of like absolute way of thinking in terms of I'm not open to any other perspective or opinion that doesn't marry up with my values and belief systems. You with me?
Mhm. I am, and it's been a challenge personally because I know when I write certain things that I'm going to lose people if they're not open to challenging this stuff. The flip side is then I seem to attract in people who are willing to question. So I have to strike a balance because I would love for my work to appeal to people who don't know about this stuff and are new to it. And that's the way I write them. I
Yeah.
write them for someone who's never heard of this before, and here's all the evidence, hundreds of citations, and so forth. But at the same time, I don't want to hold back the truth. So naturally, there are going to be some people who will not engage because they might have a certain opinion about viruses and vaccines and consciousness. If we were to actually have a dialogue, I would say, okay, explain to me why you believe those things to be true. Have you considered these things? And often they haven't considered those things. And it's rare to get in that kind of a dialogue with someone who is dogmatic about it. So ultimately, my work is not for anyone who's dogmatic. It's for people
Mm.
who are willing to question their assumptions and the things that they presuppose to be true and who are willing to look at that. And that means some people are just not going to resonate.
Yeah, so true. Are there any areas that you're really curious to go down? Like, would you go down like the religious sort of side of things, or whether we're living on a globe or a flat Earth, or is there any sort of like stuff that's off limits?
No, nothing's off limits. The only thing that's a constraint is my time and energy and just dealing with other things in life. And
Sure.
what I find is that it's like, I don't know how this works because it's happened so quickly. I mean, I never would have predicted writing one book, but six books in this short amount of time on different
Incredible.
topics. They seem to come in. And
Mm,
I take the cue when it comes in, and I now I can feel what that's like, and I follow it. So that's how I end up deciding what I'm interested in looking at. So
mm,
I don't feel like I have control over that process. I have control over whether I say yes or no to it, but things will come in their own time. But I'm interested in everything. Um, and I haven't covered everything in my books. And I'm sure there are things, this has already been happening throughout my books where I've written something and I don't totally agree with it. So part of the reason for my continued writing is to basically refine the perspective that I feel like was incomplete in other ones. And I know there are probably so many things that I've presupposed to be true in my work that I just didn't even think to question, that now I would question. I remember this in episode 1 of Where Is My Mind podcast. I talk about germs causing disease, germ theory. And I was using that as an example where it used to be the case that like we didn't know these things existed. And then we got the microscope and we could see them and we realized they cause disease. And I just took that as like, obviously that's true because all the scientists told us to. And that was an example of a paradigm shift in the same way that I think consciousness is going to be a paradigm shift. I
mm,
wasn't trying to make a grand statement about germ theory versus terrain theory because I didn't even know it was a debate. So now, obviously, I think very differently about germs. So it's this continual process of being willing to admit, okay, I was wrong or I made assumptions about things. And that means I have to be totally open to every new paradigm.
mm. So with the way that you think and what you've discovered so far, coming from where you've been in terms of the way you saw the world, the paradigm shifts that you're talking about, there will be things that are still going on in the world which are conflicting with your current view of the world, if I'm making sense. So, how do you sort of navigate through, say, for example, knowing what I've listened to so far of you, I could say your viewpoint of the medical system in terms of the vaccines, the mandates. I'd imagine we're on the same page of not taking vaccines, not getting mandating, having the free will to do whatever we choose with our body. But there's certainly quite a heavy push on taking those decisions away from you and making life quite difficult. I think you would agree that in the financial system, there's a huge push towards obviously the digital money, but then, we've got this kind of like one world government that's going to be seemingly controlling everything that's about, your money and my money and how we use it and where we can spend it. And they can kind of like turn it on and turn it off at a moment's notice. So in the face of those things, which are contradicting or at least getting in the way of your new paradigm of the world, how do you kind of like navigate yourself through life in the face of you've got kind of like forces against you?
Yeah. Well, this is core to my book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, talking about ways that we could structure society differently so that we have more freedom to be able to explore what we want to do. And the current governmental structure we have all around the world, notice statism is inherently authoritarian, whether it's a democracy or otherwise. It has that's part of the way things go in the world. So I think what you described is the spiritual war that
Yeah.
we have to navigate it. And I'm still trying to figure that out myself, navigate it in a safe way to try to explore and learn. And part of the exploration process, I meant to say this before, involves exploring a paradigm shift and then maybe not agreeing with it. So it's not like every new topic that comes in, it's just a matter of saying yes. Like I didn't know that I was going to agree with terrain theory or the notion that viruses don't exist. I was super resistant to it because I didn't know the evidence.
Yeah.
But maybe I would have come across something that made me not think that way. So it's like there's the discernment piece in all these paradigm shifts, and then the freedom to be able to look at those things. They're both critical. And It's like it's almost like a muscle that gets exercised to see like what seems to be true, what's not true, how can we reconcile various facts? And I continue to wrestle with it.
Mm, yeah. I I think for me personally, there's certain things I've been exposed to in the last, say, 10 or 15 years that have caused me to think differently. But at the same time, I find it almost like confusing to a degree where you understand that there things may be a little different to what my reality is to what someone else's reality is. But we're living in the same, how do I phrase this? You and I are seeing the world through different lenses, but it's the same lens as everyone else is seeing the world. Like it, I don't know. How am I going to say this without sounding like I'm going a bit loopy? We all have different perspectives of the world, but at the same time, there are, like I said, there are things that are going on that are kind of like in the face of what we think might be the truth or the way the world should be. So having we've got systems in play at the moment that are like you've almost got no choice but to go down and follow this same system. So I think maybe where I'm leading towards is like, do you have solutions or do you have ideas around solutions that could lead to the world in as a whole leading a better existence or having a better version of the world that's in place? So when we talk about money and we talk about the medical system or we talk about political systems, I mean, it seems like there's only really one choice to have. Do you have any ideas or perspectives that are alternate measures or something that we could implement for all of us to thrive in a better environment?
I'll start with the metaphysical answer and then I'll move into the more like physical world structuring answer. Metaphysically, the way I see it is that society is a reflection of the sum of our individual consciousnesses effectively. And maybe it's not as linear as that because you could have someone at a very high level that counterbalances a lot of negativity. I've heard that theory. But in any event, the individual consciousnesses are the source of how society is. So if we want society to be better, then that means elevating each individual consciousness. So that means people doing the work on themselves. I love Ken Wilber's framework. He talks about these various lines of development: waking up, cleaning up, growing up, and showing up. So waking up is getting to the truth about the nature of reality. Sometimes people have a visceral awakening where they experience it themselves, but that's not sufficient. Because if you could have that experience, but if you haven't cleaned up, which is looking at your trauma, looking at your belief systems and so forth, and cleaning up internally, then you could be led astray. And even that's not enough because then there's growing up, which is a maturation process, in my view. And that's accepting reality for what it is and living accordingly. And then you could do all three of those, but then you need to show up to play your part to make society a better place or make your immediate environment a better place, your family and so forth. Because alternatively, you could just say, well, I've done those other things. I've woken up, I've cleaned up, I've grown up, and now I'm going to sit on the couch and not doing anything. So I don't think passivity is the answer. It's the showing up is critical too. So
Mm,
I think that's the core of what needs to happen. And then the world would manifest accordingly. We wouldn't have the same kinds of authoritarian desires. And even if we did, we'd have more people saying, no, this is not going to happen because they're maybe a clearer vessel to be able to see things more clearly. Now, how would it be structured if that were to happen? That's the other, maybe the more physical part of this answer. And this relates to my book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, which advocates for no government.
mhm.
And government could be, the way I think about it under the model of statism is that it's a compulsory political monopoly over a certain jurisdiction, meaning it's an organization where the there's a service provider in the government. It's providing all sorts of services like road servicing, um, courts, and so forth. But unlike other service providers in society, like lawyers, investment bankers, doctors, you often sign a contract and you voluntarily hire those parties, and there's a
Right.
mutual agreement and an informed consent between the parties when they're going to provide a service. And often there's a clause where you could terminate, you have an ability to get out of it very easily. because it's all written in the contract. With government, we don't have, it's more of an implied consent. And I know there's a whole body there's a lot of people looking at the idea that have contractually obligated ourselves, but we don't know it, and there are ways to get out of that. I'm not as familiar with that part of it, but I think the concept here holds, which is that if every service in society were of that nature, where it was fully voluntary, you hired them for those things, and there was nothing that's compulsory that's imposed on you that you didn't explicitly agree to, then we wouldn't have that ability for authoritarianism in the same way. So right now we have these services, the government services that have special privileges relative to other service providers in society. So the solution there would be, the more technical term is privatization, where right now we have individuals and government providing these services. There's no reason that individuals outside of that compulsory monopoly couldn't perform the same services. And in fact, I talk about this in the Liberty book. There's all sorts of economic reasons why this is a better thing, ultimately, because the incentives are aligned in a free marketplace. If you don't do a good job, then there's someone else that a customer could hire. With governments, it doesn't work like that, especially within a certain jurisdiction. You're stuck with that one government. You might have different political leaders, but it's the same government structure. And maybe you could move somewhere else. But in the case of the United States, for example, expatriation can be very challenging. You might still end up having to pay taxes to the homeland. Not everyone can just get up and move. So it's much more complicated to get out of that system. Whereas in a free market, theoretically, it could be as good, if not better. And most likely, in many cases, it would be better. That's the short version, but there's a lot of complications. That's why I had to write a book about it.
Yeah. I guess also to add to that, I mean, there are a lot of organizations that have influence on government decisions and policies. And so you almost have this sort of like fragments of governing bodies that are kind of like aiding decisions. And it's almost like under the guise of it's for your own good and it's for the betterment of the world. But it has this undertone of like, could be quite sinister in the wrong hands. And I think that whole one world government type of push is something that scares the shit out of me, to be honest with you. Like it seems like the solution that you just proposed is like a far distance from the solution that is currently on offer. You with me?
Yes.
So
I agree. What I described is more like a North Star that we should strive toward. I don't know if it's attainable in the society. I think it would need to be accompanied by the consciousness shift that I described too. But it's moving us away from government and toward liberty. Whereas a lot of the movements, like you said, and especially the Great Reset, they're all about like consolidating authority.
Yeah.
So we need to be moving away from that consolidation of power, and how that could be done. That gets into real tactics of people who know the system from the inside. And could there be political leaders who are elected who could take down the system from inside itself? So the new president of Argentina, he speaks a lot like I'm talking about with voluntarism. He's a fan of the Austrian School of Economics, which is a free market school of thinking that goes very well with voluntarism. So there's a movement in this direction. We'll see how it actually works in practice, because even if a politician gets in to one of these positions, first of all, we never know who's actually controlled or if they're just putting on a front. Like, we never know that sort of thing. But is the government structure itself so tied up that even if you had the right person with the right morals in place, that it couldn't be deconstructed from the inside? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't personally been as interested in those things, but I know there are a lot of people thinking tactically of like, here's the system. How could we work within the system to bring it down or to decrease the power from within? That's maybe an intermediate step. Although I hear other people who say what I just described it's a gradualism, that we have these big governments all over the world and gradually we would reduce the power. I've heard other people say that it's not going to be a gradual process. It's going to be like overnight. It's not, at some point where it's going to be a nonlinear shift where all of a sudden the power structures just aren't going to be there, and we're going to have to figure things out in a more of a natural way where it's about private property and people and parties interacting voluntarily. But I don't know.
I think my perspective is that it's in life and in the history, if you go back eons, like it's almost like there's chaos before order. So it needs to get to a point where it's like super bad. And I think if you just look at, say, someone who is improving their health, the catalyst is not normally I'm just into health and I'm going to just start exercising and lifting weights and eating right. In most cases, people are on the wrong track for a long time, and it gets to a point where they have a huge illness or an accident or something happens, and then all of a sudden there's a huge pendulum swing to I'm now living a life that's really healthy. And I think that the world is kind of like at a precipice, I think, of having that sort of like come to an end. It's almost like there's going to be a huge crescendo to this paradigm of the world that we currently live in. And I guess the underlying fear with all of that is that there's a lot of pain that we're going to have to withstand before we get to that point.
Mhm.
Are you on the same path as that, or do you think that we'll kind of like just get to a point where enough is enough, and now we're going to change lanes?
I think it depends on the state of consciousness of the individuals, how we want this to go. For my second book, An End to Upside Down An End to Upside Down Living, I studied spiritual awakenings in individuals, not just historically, but also in the modern era. And there are many similarities, one of which is a dark night of the soul, where if their soul was leading them on a path that was not right or optimal, they would encounter pain effectively and suffering that is intended to steer the person or teach them a lesson, to steer them in a new direction for the purpose of the soul growth. So what we see in the world today with that context in mind, it looks like society is going through its dark night of the soul, and we get to choose, are we just going to continue down a path and we're going to be shown more and more pain and not listen to the signs, or are we going to navigate another way? I think health is very similar. I look at symptoms now from that perspective, that we're always learning something about our own consciousness and where it's leading us. And if we shift our consciousness, then perhaps we can shift our health. And the symptoms are telling us that it's time to move. So right now we're getting all kinds of warning signs. And historically, we could probably see many other warning signs too, but now it seems like it is accelerating, especially with technology. That's a bit different than we've had at other points in history. So there is this bubbling up. I mean, COVID was a unique event where the entire world was shut down at the same time. So these are very unique things that are happening. And we just see unrest everywhere, geopolitically and otherwise. So the optimistic lens on this is, wow, we have an opportunity to transcend the darkness that's probably been on this planet for a long time. And we don't have a choice but to make a change and take a side ultimately, like you said. So with regard to vaccines or masks, these are binary things. You wear the mask or you don't wear the mask. You get the vaccine or you don't. And you have to make a decision, even if your confidence isn't 100%. And so increasingly, we're being asked to make these decisions. And it seems like there's a bifurcation of people that are making similar decisions in one direction, which is more about freedom and bodily autonomy, and others that want to go with the system and trust the experts no matter what.
Mm. Do you predict that there could be a fragmentation of like us and them, or we will be living under one governance in one area, like you were alluding to before, and then others will have their own sort of sets of rules, and all of a sudden we do have do you want to move to Australia and live under our government, or do I want to move to America and live under yours because I don't know, you got better rules?
It seems like there is this fragmentation. And I was just at a conference where I gave a talk. It's called Confluence. It was in Texas, hosted by Alex Zeck.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a group of people that's probably very much like your audience, based on the way that you're speaking and the people you've interviewed, very open-minded, part of this movement of people who want to ask questions about the nature of reality and think we should take personal responsibility. So that kind of ethos was in all the people there. And I just had this sense that it's part of the bifurcation, that there are going to be people like this and then people who are not like this, generally speaking. And maybe there will be a parallelization, if that's a word, of society where some people are living one way in parallel with other people who make other choices, who want to be part of the authoritarian regimes and follow the experts and just trust the science, quote unquote.
Mm.
Whereas others are going to ask the questions and then they're going to find their own ways to coexist.
Mm. I don't mind that. I think like up until COVID, that's kind of how I viewed the world. It was like, do whatever the fuck you like. It's your life, it's your body. However you want to live your life is your choice, and however I want to live mine is mine. So if we can just respect one another's views and opinions, and just agree to get along, I don't see a problem with that. I think that when we talk about consciousness and ego and people having absolute control and power and wanting to dominate the earth, so to speak, I mean, that's where I think a part of that evolution in consciousness and or elevation in consciousness needs to really come about.
I think you're hitting on the key point. This is about a shift in consciousness, and even the approach you described of being okay with disagreeing with someone and letting them do their thing. That's part of freedom, is to allow people in their soul to have the journey that they need to do without trying to control them. And that
Mm,
doesn't mean not giving advice. That's very different than controlling someone. To see someone maybe going on a path that to us looks dangerous, to say, here's some evidence, perhaps you want to reconsider, but it's their personal autonomy to make those decisions. So
yeah.
there probably will have to be a natural bifurcation, or maybe a bifurcation is too strong. There might be like strata of where people are on their journey, um, where there's just going to be different levels of open-mindedness and different paradigms that people have transcended. So I could use my own journey. I wasn't aware of the germ theory, terrain theory debate several years ago. And based on where I was and other things going on in my life, I would not have had the time or the ability to get there.
Mm,
So I could have criticized myself in hindsight and said, like, you were so stupid. How could you do this? But there was no possibility, basically, that I could have gotten there. And even if I did get there, let's just say I did, then there would be another paradigm that, let's say, the voluntarism paradigm or the non-human intelligence, the great reset, that I wouldn't have gotten to because I was just focused on that one. That's just my personal example. I'm
mm,
sure your members of your audience would have a similar process where you have to do it on your own time, and there's certain constraints whereby it's going to be in your time frame and not the one that maybe you would hope it is. So we have to, I think that perspective hopefully gives a level of compassion to people who are at different stages and maybe they haven't had the time to explore these topics. Maybe they were dealing with something in their family and they haven't been able to explore this information. And I can say for myself, if I hadn't been exposed to all this information, I probably wouldn't ask the questions that I'm asking now.
mm.
So,
Yeah.
and then the deeper question is like, why is that the case? Maybe we're on different journeys for our souls, that we have literal different journeys that we're supposed to be on.
Yeah. I like the idea that, or the concept, and you know much more about this than what I do, is that if we agree that human consciousness is this one big, I don't know, cloud system, and we can all tap into it to a higher degree or a lower degree, or depending on how much we're in tune with, the conduit between us and the cloud, so to speak. So I think that there's stages in your life that help you become more connected to meaning, purpose, where you need to go. And the more that you kind of reside in, like, get out of your mind and into your body, and kind of connect to that, like, what does this mean for me right now? And being open to things being different and maybe seeing things through a new lens. It's almost like there's a universal consciousness that drops a little knowledge of wisdom into Mark and into Adrian, and it's like, if you pick it up, I'll run with this with you, but if not, I'm just going to go like to the next person, and whoever's
Mhm.
like plugged in, so to speak, is just going to get the information. Does that make sense to you?
That's what it feels like to me. And it was what I was alluding to when I said that the hit comes, and then I have the option of saying yes or no when it comes. We all
Mm,
have that. We have the apparent free will, which is a very complicated topic, to run with it when the opportunity is there. But the key is to identify the opportunity. And I found that it's a process of trial and error, because it's a feeling that I could try to describe, but it wouldn't do justice to what it is. When something comes in and I say, I have to explore this. I saw it with the virus thing, because I remember hearing in early 2020, Dr. Andy Kaufman, he was on the Brian Rose show, talking about no virus. And that was a radical thing at the time, because it was already radical enough to say, hey, COVID is about a vaccine agenda. COVID's not quite as severe as people think it is. There are remedies that could save people's lives. The ventilators are killing people and so forth, and they're censoring. That was already a radical position. And then Dr. Kaufman, Thomas Cowan, Dr. Sam and Mark Bailey, they're saying, well, that's all true, and there isn't even a virus in the first place.
mm.
I was like, a lot of people thought it was a psyop, but then the time came in, which was when I met Alec I was at a Courtney Turner's conference in Tennessee, and he was speaking on the topic. And then he did the end of COVID, which is like over 100 hours on this topic,
Mhm.
where I had the time and the receptiveness to look at it. And I had this feeling of, yeah, I'm resistant to it because this is so controversial and I'm going to lose people probably, but I've got to explore this. I knew the sensation because I had done it other times before. So it's
Mm,
like getting to that internal compass to be able to know and discern, okay, I've got to explore this. And I explored it not with a fixed conclusion. I didn't start off saying, okay, definitely no virus. I started with what is the argument that these people are trying to convey? Because this is a highly controversial topic. It's dividing the health freedom community. It would be a
totally.
good thing if we resolved this to have a more united health freedom community. And in order to resolve it, we need to understand this position of what is no virus. Like that's basically how I approached it. And the more I
Mm,
went into it, I said, they make very good points. And the points they're raising are not the ones that are even made by the people dismissing them. Like they're often straw man arguments trying to counter it because they don't even know the position. So, okay, I need to understand this. Oh, wow. This is shifting my own consciousness in terms of how I think about my own health. And then the process continues from there.
mm. I interviewed Sam Bailey a couple of years ago, and she was just, I think, co-authoring or co-writing a book about terrain theory versus germ theory and things like that. So that was kind of my little segue into looking at that aspect of viruses, which is yeah, I love it. I just recently interviewed Daniel Reuters. Have you ever heard of Daniel Reuters?
Yes, yeah, he has a new book out. I want to read it, but I've heard him on a bunch of
Yeah, How to Catch
interviews.
a Cold.
Really
Well,
good
can you catch
stuff.
a cold? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Man, he's a great guy and a wealth of information. So along the same sort of lines, my just to sort of touch on like your experience through COVID and having an opinion and losing people, like I think for me personally, I can kind of go back to maybe 2000 and I don't know, 3, 4, 5, where I was sort of on this learning path, or these things were kind of like I said before, dumped onto me, whether it be by a friend or whether it be something that I'm coming across, which was about the banking system, about 9/11,
Yeah.
um, just all of that kind of like uh, chaos by design, and that was my entry point into thinking the world's a little different. But I kept most of my opinions to myself. And so I would kind of look and watch and learn and all the rest of it, and you watch YouTube videos for 3 hours, every night, that sort of thing, but never really express my feelings or points of view with anyone because I just didn't want to be ostracized or, left out or thought like I was, some sort of kook. COVID-19 hit, and because of my, I guess, education on that side of things, I just saw it as a like huge red flag straight away, and started to question it. I've been in business for 20 years, and my business was suffering greatly. Like I just opened up a new business, and within 6 weeks, I got shut down. So I was dying a natural death, and at the same time, I was just so disgruntled. But my personal viewpoint was I went through a period of being very angry with the world because of the division and just how much like hatred was expressed on myself for having a differing opinion for the first time on a mass scale, because I stuck my neck out publicly and said, I just don't think things add up, and I think we're going down the wrong path. That was my entry point into just being ostracized and shunned and ridiculed and blamed and shamed and all that kind of stuff. The trajectory of all of that was that okay, well now that I've unloaded on everyone and everyone knows that this is where I sort of sit, I started to feel very comfortable in that position as the new version of me that I wanted to share with the world. So now it's nothing for me to say comments and opinions and viewpoints and perspectives on the way I think the world is and the way it should be, or whether, this is my opinion. And like you said before, like I can give you advice and recommendations as to where I think you should be, or if you're asking me for an opinion or a direction. But it's up to you as to whether you want to come along. And so I've got this perspective now of like, do you want to come on board or not? Like, it's up to you. I don't really care one way or another. I'm not doing this for vanity reasons, for likes or influencing. I don't consider myself an influencer in any way. Um, but I've definitely found like a keen tribe of people that want to talk to me. People like
Mhm.
you. Like, I think you're amazing. And I say this almost every podcast. Like when I ask people like yourself to come on the show, it always just like, I don't know, it stuns me when people say yes. But I think that's that whole like consciousness connected with each other on like you can kind of get a sense of, I think this is a good vibe. And I don't mind having a conversation, hanging around, and my audience certainly appreciates it, because I get messages like, probably like you do, like just all the time, of people saying, just really appreciate what you're doing and how you do it and how you go about it. I don't jump down anyone's throat and force my opinion on anyone. I just speak my mind.
Yeah, I think you're doing super important work. We need as many voices as possible getting this stuff out there, and it can be life-changing. One conversation, like in my case, heard a podcast, and that was the first domino that led me on this path. So, especially while we have platforms that allow the information to get out, I think it's
Yeah.
important to do so. And I think you're also describing something really important that probably many members of your audience have experienced, which is like a change in tolerance that we develop to speaking about certain topics or just speaking in general or expressing an opinion. So for me, it was a threshold to talk about consciousness. I mean, I was working on the partner track in Silicon Valley, and I was going to write a book about science of the afterlife, science of reincarnation, science of psychic phenomena. That was at first, I'm like, wait, that's kind of a crazy thing to do. And then I became comfortable talking about that. And then COVID happened and I was quiet. I was like, can I talk about vaccines? What's going on with politics? And it took a lot of, I don't know, going back and forth internally to say, yeah, I'm going to publish this book on politics. And it's gone on and on for these other topics. So then what starts to happen, I've noticed, is that the desire to express the truth transcends the fear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say we should express the truth in a way that could cause danger or in a way that's unnecessarily educational. I think there are ways to be smart about it, but the general desire to express the truth takes takes precedence. That's what I found, and it sounds like that's where you are too.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. And I also think that, like for me, connecting with people like you, it's almost like it keeps me in check with that feeling of, am I on the right path or not? You know, like even as clear with my vision as I am, at the same time, there's also an indecisiveness, or at least a constant questioning of, are you on the right path? And is this the right way to go about things? And that could be with my health, or in my relationships, or in business, or like whatever, like in any aspect of life. So I'm constantly questioning the direction and narrative of like just how I conduct myself, because I don't know, I have a vision and at least a wanting to leave the world a better place than what I found it. Right? Does that make
Yeah,
sense? So like I
yeah.
want to
I
make
mean,
an impact, and I think like you've done that sensationally well with all your books. Like that will live. Well, hopefully it'll live forever.
yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, sometimes I wonder, like, am I having an impact at all, or does it even matter? I mean, what it feels like to me when I'm, especially in the process of writing a book, there's a passion that comes over me where I just have to get it done. And then when the book's done, it's sort of like, well, it's going to do what it's going to do. Maybe 5 people read it, maybe 100 people do. My books don't have a massive audience based on the sales numbers, but it could be like one person that reads it that it's really important to, and also the time frame we don't know. Like, let's say this conversation, someone hears it in 10 years and it has a huge impact on them. We never know when we put content out what or how the impact is going to be. So that, I think we just have to follow that impulse that we start to recognize within ourselves that tells us we need to do something, and then the outcome is beyond our control.
Mm, yeah, I totally agree with that. Hey, Mark, listen, I think we could probably talk for another 2 or 3 hours. We haven't touched on ET contact or like any other sort of topics that would be great to go down. But um, I think at the moment this would be a great place for people to leave off and go and find out more about you. Like I said, you've certainly impacted my life. I think that just listening to how diplomatic you are in terms of explaining how you come about your discoveries and findings, and how you express it in a way that leaves me open to making a decision for myself whether I want to take on board what you're saying or not, is really commendable. I am jealous of the fact that like you don't look that old, and you're certainly on a path that is making a huge impact and influence. And I think you've only just sort of like scratched the surface of it all. So I want to thank you and appreciate you for everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian, and I want to thank you for all that you're doing as well.
I appreciate you, brother. Hey, listen, where can people go to find out more about you and learn about your work?
My website, which is just my name, it's markgober.com. All of my books are on Amazon. They're available in paperback, Kindle. Well, some of them are hard copy, but hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I read all the Audibles myself. And my podcast, Where is My Mind? It's an 8-episode series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major podcast players.
Excellent. Yeah, I highly recommend everyone to go and listen to that podcast. I'll definitely go and buy all of your books. I think it'd be great to sit down and chew through all of those. So yeah, I appreciate you, man, and hopefully we can circle back and have another conversation soon.
For sure. Thanks, Adrian.
All right, buddy. Talk soon.